Good evening, everyone. I'm Pat Nash, and I want to thank you all for coming out on this rather brisk gathering tonight. And just before I go any further, I've been asked to remind you all, please complete your survey forms and handwritten the powers to be over here.
It's not me.
Father is no stranger to St. Blake's Parish. He was a long-time parishioner prior to the 20th. And after completing his graduate studies, he came back to be our parish priest here at St. Blake's. We're all anxious to hear Father Paul, himself a member of a blended family. He's going to share with us how a personal relationship with Christ can unify and heal and bring peace in those families. Father Paul?
It is cold out. It's going to snow this weekend, though, so I guess it could be worse tonight. I'm going to start off, I'm going to tell you a joke to make a point. It's not a dirty joke, but I think it is a little off color for a church group, so I apologize in advance. Yeah, Father Jay can cover his ears. We'll be all right. Here it is anyway. There's an 18-year-old boy who came home excitedly one night and he announced to his father, he says, "Kelly and I are getting married." His father's face fell. And he took him to one side and he said, "I'm sorry, son, you can't marry Kelly. When I was first married to your mother, I'm afraid that I fooled around a lot. You see, Kelly is your half-sister." The boy was devastated. It took him nearly 6 months to start dating again. But a year later, he came home with more good news. He says, "Ellie and me are getting married." And his father's face dropped again. And he took the boy aside and he said the same thing to him again. So the boy ran up to his room with his hands in his head, on his head, and flooding with tears. And his mother came to comfort him. And he said to her, he says, "You know, Dad's done a lot of bad things. He keeps saying to me that I can't marry the girl that I love." To which his mother responded, "Pay no attention to him, he's not your real father." So. I said, I know it's a little off color for the church. And of course, it's an extreme kind of example, but I think it does illustrate something of a point. Because while I doubt that anyone who's in this room, or myself especially, has a story that is that convoluted or that crazy, I believe that we've become so numb to crazy family situations in this world that most of us probably wouldn't bat much of an eye if we were to hear about a situation like that. We might shake our heads, but I doubt we wouldn't believe that it was possible. Contrast that to just a few decades ago. It would have been shocking. Would it get a response from me? I'm sure it would. But I don't think it would be one of outright shock for me as well. And I guess that says something about the world in which we live. As I said, it's an extreme case. But the point it illustrates is something that we have to deal with, all of us have to deal with in some way in our family lives, individually, in our own families, in the church, and in the world, something that gets more and more prevalent as years advance. It's something that's always been there since the first sin in the Garden of Eden, but it's something that we seem to come up with new and new ways to do this, and that's to complicate things. Complication. The world gets more and more complicated all the time. And how many of us, and I know I'm not going to get one raised hand on this, how many of us have had a perfect family existence, a perfect family life? Moving beyond that, How many of us have dealt with the realities of divorce or children outside of marriage, either through our parents, ourselves, our children, someone close to us? You don't have to raise your hand. I'm sure I could assume that pretty much everybody knows at least someone. How many of us have half-brothers and half-sisters, step-brothers or step-sisters, step-parents, step-children, etc.? A lot. Right? Human relationships are complicated, and there's an additional level of complication that arises when we find ourselves confronted with our faith, with the teachings of the church, that we are meant to uphold and to defend and ideally to follow. Let me use that, I think, as a starting point. It's a foundational statement for what you are going to hear me say, or perhaps more precisely, not hear me say tonight. You will not hear me contradict church teaching. You will not hear me tell you that I believe the sacrament of marriage is not a sacred and unbreakable bond between a husband and a wife. You will not hear me say that sexual relationships outside of marriage are good things. In fact, if I were to be questioned or challenged on any of the church's teaching on marriage and family life, on human sexuality, on morality, I would fall on the side of strongly defending the teachings. And it wouldn't be out of some sense of obligation, because where I would be defending it with my mouth, but only because I had to, not believing what it was that I was saying. Let me clearly state that I strongly agree with the teachings of the church, the commandments that we believe have come from God. I believe in them because I believe I understand why these teachings exist, that they are not meant to be restrictions, limiting human life and existence, limiting our freedom. I believe wholly and truly that the teachings of the church in these areas are the ideal to which all of us are meant to strive towards. They are truly the way that we find ourselves most fully fulfilled. I believe that they exist for a reason, that God and the church have placed them in front of us because, as I said, they truly are a way in which we can be happy in this life. That if we were able to live them out exactly as they have been placed before us, they are a gateway to a life that is filled with grace and happiness and truth. You know, the world looks at the teachings of the church on life and morality and sexuality as a series of negatives. It sees it as a series of no's, of you cannots. It's not what they're meant to be. They're instead extensions of positives, of life-giving truths about the creation and the world in which we live. For example, and this is a difficult one, a prohibition against divorce is the natural extension of an understanding of the sacred and divinely formed bond that is marriage, which also includes the family life aspect of the sacrament. However, and you know that there is always going to be a however, there's always going to be a but. Human life in this world is not as black and white as we wish it would be. The situations that we find ourselves in our lives are not only not perfect, they are not always even good. We live in a world that is full of temptation, where our understanding, our maturity, it develops and it changes throughout our lives. We make mistakes, we make decisions, some of them right, some of them wrong, some which, while maybe not the wrong ones, are incomplete. They're not well thought out, that maybe we weren't prepared to make or didn't understand as well as we thought we did when we were making them. Finally, I know that we are sinners, that sometimes what we believe is the right and the good direction to go, whether through good intention or through selfishness and temptation and pride and guilt and even sometimes despair, ends up after a further evaluation and sometimes long after a decision has been made to clearly have not been in line with the best practices of the moral life, but also not in our own best interests. Our vision of the world around us is usually incomplete. Our understanding of the complications that our decisions have caused in our lives often only come into focus in hindsight. Even things that we were sure were going to result in lifelong goods for us don't always end up there. And that happens at some point, I think, to all of us. There's something else that I know, though. I know, and I hope that you do as well, that this same complicated and difficult world is the exact world into which Jesus Christ stepped as one of us. This is the same world in which he lived and taught and healed and called for disciples to follow him. Sanctity and holiness and grace can't exist without the presence of God, and yet these things are all around us. If that is the case, then this world and our lives, which are difficult and complicated and messy, we know that Christ is right down there in the mess with us. And not only that, there's a more important revelation that I think we need to make about grace. Grace that comes from a God who knows us all too well. Sometimes he can even use the mess. He can enter into our complication and our imperfection, and he can turn it into something that is good, even if we haven't followed every commandment or every instruction, even when our relationships and our choices lack perfection. God can still be found in the situations that result. I know there's a big difference between perfect and good, and I sometimes think that we can seriously undervalue how important good is. We're always meant in this world as people of faith to strive towards the ideal, towards perfection. But we should never let the pursuit of perfection cause us to ignore good. Because whenever something is good, it is fundamentally because God can be found within it. I also at least feel like I need to acknowledge something that should be obvious, and something which is part of what we will discuss tonight. That not all complicated family dynamics are caused by our own choices or our own decisions. There's something else that can throw us into turmoil. Well, it's something also that is part of living in an imperfect world. And it's not something that anyone or anyone in a relationship especially chooses. And it's the reality of death. It's the reality of loss. Especially the death of a parent or of a spouse can lead to profound and intense spiritual and psychological pain for those who experience it. And it affects all the future relationships of those who are involved. Now, this isn't a session about bereavement. And much of what I'm going to say tonight focuses specifically on blended families that result from, for lack of a better way of putting it, broken families. But some of what will be said, I think, apply even in these unchosen and difficult situations, because even that reality often results in new relationships and new family dynamics. And these new dynamics, while different, are no less complicated than any other blended family. So with that very extended introduction, it's time to talk about me and my family. I have to be honest with you. I did not choose the topic for tonight. If I'd been allowed to create a talk that I was going to give myself, this would not have been the subject I would have chosen. This was assigned to me by Bob and by those who put the calendar for these sessions together. Now, I'm not upset about it because I wasn't forced into it. I was asked. But it is something that is pretty personal to me, and I think, like all of us, when it comes to matters of faith, if we have to mix it with family, yikes. I'm not actually sure if those who thought I should do this session were aware of my own family history at the time, or if it was just something of a coincidence. I know that some of you don't know me very well at all. Some of you have only known me in the short time that I've been assigned here. Some of you, as Pat said, have known me for a significant portion of the almost 24 years, I think it's been around 24 years, that have passed since I came to this parish when I was 13, 14 years old. I doubt, however, that even those of you who know me are fully aware of my family story. I'm an only child, or at least I was. That all changed a few years before I became a teenager. My mom, who is here right now, sitting over there, hi Mom, is also an only child from a Catholic family, a Neapolitan and Sicilian family, Martoni and Sotilli. Her parents met after they emigrated to the Bronx, where she was born, before later moving to Nassau County on Long Island, but she now lives in Lawrence Township. My father, who isn't here right now, lives close enough to this chapel that if I were to put it in my GPS right now, it would probably come up in feet and not miles. He comes from a family of 7 dairy farmers from Mount Holly in Burlington County. As to his family lineage, he likes to say that his family heritage is the Heinz 57 varieties. We used to joke that because his family lived on a farm, they were born in shifts. There were 2 or 3 kids to work on the farm, and then after a few years, 2 or 3 more, so that just as one group was old enough to move off the farm, the younger ones would be old enough to start working on the farm. And then my dad is, if I had to describe it, a lapsed Methodist. He believes in God, but aside from coming here, which he does once in a while when I have Mass, he hasn't been to church regularly in probably 30 years. He's not going to mind me saying this, don't worry. Since my parents were married in the church, my dad did consent that I be raised as a Catholic, and when I was very young, we all did go to church together. However, my parents divorced, and they've been divorced for over 30 years, almost probably more than 80% of my life on this earth. And it's because of that that I do have a story to tell you that might fit with tonight's subject. It was a dark night in April of 1987. I was with my mom. We were outside of St. Anthony of Padua Church in Hightstown. Neither of us was really that excited to be there. Me, because I was a young kid who was going to have to spend the night with people who were at least 4 times his age and some of much older. And her, because she had thrown her back out earlier that day and could hardly stand up straight. We were there because there was going to be kind of a game social night for separated and divorce groups around the diocese. And my mom was active in the group from Corpus Christi in Willingboro. She was one of the organizers for the evening. When we got to the church, the lights were off. The lights in the parish hall were off. The doors were locked. We wondered if we had the right night, whether the church had forgotten about us, what we were going to do to get in. And there was a man who approached us, who we came to find out was there for the same reason that we were there. He was part of a group from St. James in Pennington. He decided to take a walk around the building to see if he could find a way in or another door that might be unlocked. And a few minutes later, the door to the church hall opened from the inside, and here he was letting us in. It wasn't until we began going into the building that we found out he had basically broken into the church. I think it's okay, because it's been almost 30 years, and I'm pretty sure that the statute of limitations is up on breaking and entering. So I can spill that his name is Stan, and he's here as well. And he's my stepfather, and he has been for over 25 years. In fact, both of us like to remind my mother that I met him that night before she did, although I claim no responsibility for the relationship at any point after that. I don't have time to give you my entire family history, even from that moment tonight. It's been interesting. It certainly had its ups and downs. On my mom's side, I have 2 stepsisters, one that's a few years older than me, one that's within a few months of my own age. My father remarried only a few months after my mother did. And in that relationship, I also have 2 stepsisters, one a few years older than me, and one who ended up as my high school classmate at Steiner. To say that my life turned upside down in just a few years is probably the understatement of the century. I went from an only child living with my mom and seeing my dad a few times a week to having step-parents, multiple families, 4 stepsisters, moving, new schools, everything. It's not always easy, and I know every situation is different. I'm sure that some of my experience is common to others that find themselves in circumstances like mine. I've had, and Stan will admit, I've had rocky relationships at times with both of my step-parents. Without too much comment on the hows and the whys, I will tell you that I lived with my mom after their remarriage while I was in 6th and 7th grade. And then in 8th grade, I moved in with my dad until about halfway through my senior year of high school. And then I moved back with my mom. From then until I finally moved out of the house again into my own apartment, and that's a whole other story. None of the moves back and forth happened under pleasant circumstances. They instead came amidst strained relationships, arguments, accusations, sometimes irrationality from all the parties involved, myself, I'm sure, included. And yet for all that happened, Problems between my parents, between me and my step-parents, between my step-parents and others involved. I can say with absolute truth that when I look back at those years of my life, those unpleasant moments do not cause me bitterness or even greatly affect how I look at my adolescent and my teenage years. I consider them to be good years. And while there are many reasons that this is the case, there is one place in particular that I can point to, and my mom would agree, that played a significant role in why these years were good. And the place that I can point to is actually the piece of property that we are standing in, or that I am standing in, you're sitting in right now. When I moved in with my dad, who, as I already said, wasn't Catholic, for the first time in my life at the age of 13, 14, it was up to me whether or not I was going to continue to be a person of faith, if I was going to continue to be a member of the church that I was still growing up in and had received most of my sacraments in. I still needed to finish confirmation at the time, which my mom actually taught, not here, at another church. It was complicated. The decision that I made was to say yes to that. And St. Gregory's became my parish. It became, in some ways, for me, a home away from home, especially through the people I met here in the youth ministry program. People like crazy Father Mike Lang, for those of you who remember him, Deacon Ralph LaMancha, Deacon Andy Sabatis, friends from school and other schools that I met while I was here. People I've met in years after that. Deacon Bill was one of them over the years. I'm sure that's why he's here tonight, so he can give me looks from the back row. At a time in my life where it would have been easy to go off in some pretty crazy directions and feel like I didn't belong anywhere, I found out that I did belong here. Now, I'm not sure if I understood all the implications of that at the time. I'm not sure that I fully understood where God was working in my life. I mean, I was 14 or 15 years old. Did I really appreciate that it was very much the grace of God that placed these people in this place in my life? Maybe I didn't. But I don't think that it was totally lost on me either. There is more to this, though, that I want to make sure I acknowledge. This was not all me. And while I know that God's grace is at work in everything that we do, it was not all because of the people here that this experience became so important to me, that these were good years. The foundation of my faith was laid before that, in my own family. My desire for a connection to the church came from there as well. It came from how important faith was to my mom and to my grandparents. It came from Stan, my stepfather, whose own connection to his parish and to the youth ministry that actually existed there at St. James, which made me aware of the possibilities that it could exist for me here. It was my dad who supported me being brought up in the faith before I lived with him, who never stood in the way of me connecting to this place, who instead of begrudgingly allowing me to find a place in the church, encouraged it, and was mostly happy that I felt it was important that I come here. I consider myself very fortunate when it comes to family relationships because there were some significantly rocky periods in my past. You know, I said I have parents that have been divorced for 30 plus years, and the dynamics of our relationship between that day and today have been, and at times continue to be, far from perfect. We still have roadblocks at times. But you know what? Less than 6 years ago, just through those doors. So how did I know this was going to happen? Anyway, but sitting in the front rows of that very church, my mom, my dad, my stepfather, my stepmother, maybe not entirely comfortably, but still there, sat together in the same pew as I celebrated my first Mass here as a priest. I see and I talk to both of my parents regularly, which may not sound like much to some people here, but for those who are aware of what broken and blended families can sometimes be like, you know how rare and blessed I have been to have that be the case. And I know that it is by the grace of God and in many ways the explicit faith of those involved that we have remained families and a family that stays together. You know, love is a virtue that comes from God, and without Him being a part of it, it is fickle and it is changeable and it is shallow. I've seen that very clearly in some of the relationships of people that I've dealt with and who have come to talk to me here and other parishes over the last few years. But when God is a part of it, I've learned that it can be good As I said, even when it isn't perfect. It's enough about me for now. How does this move beyond just me? How does my experience become broad enough to encompass situations that others find themselves in? Some of which are similar to mine, some of which are very different. There are many instances where Scripture stories can be difficult to hear, to understand, or to interpret. For me, one of those has always been the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 31 through 35, a passage that is paralleled in all the other synoptic Gospels as well. It appears in Matthew 12, it appears in Luke 8. It contains language that seems to be taken right from someone who has recently been thrust into a blended family and is trying to find their way. I'm going to read it for you. You're going to know what it is as soon as I start if you don't already know. His mother and his brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. The crowd seated around him told him, "Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you." But he said to them in reply, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking around at those seated in the circle, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." I remember hearing this at one point in my life and thinking how others in difficult family situations must hear a reading like that. Does it actually affirm them in their disconnection from their families? Does it make them question their place in the world? Does it confuse them, making them think that perhaps their families aren't important? It's one of those times where I realize that, and we do affirm this as a church, that all of Scripture is worthwhile for reading and for study and for instruction. But sometimes a cold, out-of-context reading can be confusing and perhaps maybe even a bit misleading at times. You know, there are many places in the Scriptures where the family connection and family life is greatly affirmed, not the least of which is the Nativity story, which we went through only a few weeks ago. Remember Jesus' care for his mother at the foot of the cross and her devotion to him. There are plenty of examples, though, throughout Scripture. But looking at this particular reading, I think it's easy to misinterpret it. For broken families, for blended families, for those of us in complicated family situations, for those whose family dynamics change drastically at expected or sometimes at unexpected points in their life. I think, though, maybe this isn't a reading that should make us more confused. It should actually help us, because I think there's something else going on here. In context, the reading comes as a response. It follows Jesus' naming of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit as the greatest sin. It comes after a discussion of the influence of evil and of the devil. It comes after Jesus affirms a statement that was made famous in this country about 1840 years later by Abraham Lincoln, where he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In context, I think it's part of a broader understanding of the world, of the church, of even what it means to be a family. Because it takes our understanding of family and places it firmly in the realm of discipleship. It is not that Jesus is placing being a disciple of following him as something that is more important than family life, because I think he would consider that these things are too interconnected for that to be true. In fact, I think it's the reverse. Jesus is trying to explain what being a disciple means, what it means to follow him, what the radical communal nature of his call to his disciples is. There is only one way for him to do this. There is only one way for Christ, who always uses analogies or images to make his point, to explain what you are entering into by becoming a disciple of his will. And the image that he uses is that of a family. It just happens that his own family is there to help him with that image, unwittingly. It's such a strong image, not only for his audience at the time, but it's an image that is strong across all of time. And because of that, it's the only one that he can use to explain what it means to belong to him and to belong to God. This is not a replacement of family life, it is an emphasizing of it, but it's placing it in a different context, I think. You know, in our lives, we have multiple levels of communal and familial existence. All of humanity, the church, our parish, but the most basic, the most powerful existence, the most powerful image for us, The most powerful version of family life for us, I guess, that's not probably the best word for that, but that's our personal families. However, I think that this can and does allow us to recognize family in a broader and a more expansive way. The perfect ideal of the family is, of course, the nuclear family, which we have called throughout our history as a church not just important, but the domestic church, the first teacher of believers in the faith. But remember what it was that I said about perfect and good. Just because our family doesn't meet what would be the pictured ideal doesn't mean that God is not a part of it. And if we allow Christ to be a part of it, our imperfection, as I said multiple times already, can still be good. Our relationships can still be good. If we can expand our vision of our own families to recognize that we can exist beyond, or at least not quite in the ideal, then we can allow ourselves to see grace, to recognize God at work within new relationships, new bonds, new realities. This is a difficult thing for us because we don't like change. What is considered normal family life is difficult enough, and there is no such thing as a non-dysfunctional family, right? However, when the circumstances that we find ourselves in change abruptly, when it morphs into something that is uncomfortable or uncertain or unfamiliar, it's even harder. We find ourselves having to share our affections and our attention. Relationships are altered. Even something as simple as the alteration of our regular routine can be something that we become very provincial, very protective of, to the point of pretty extreme selfishness sometimes. Communication within every family is hard, but it's essential. And it needs to be honesty which comes from love. We don't talk to each other as we should. We don't always communicate. We close ourselves off in emotional times. We can refuse to participate in new realities. Sometimes we feel like we're justified in doing so because our lives feel so uprooted. But there's an ancient biblical term for the refusal to engage, to communicate, even when it's difficult. It's one that appears over and over in the Old Testament, and it even makes its way into the New Testament. It's called hardness of heart. How do we move beyond it? Not easily, probably not all at once, but it is possible. Because are we a people of faith? I would hope so, or we probably wouldn't be here. It's through being open to each other that our hardness of heart begins to loosen. But I've learned, as I am sure that you have, that even when we don't understand that it is happening, the only way our hearts truly soften is if we are open to God and to His grace. Trust in each other is impossible if we don't trust in God. Faith in each other is the same way. Hope in our futures can only come if we have the virtue of hope itself. I mentioned that in the beginning, before that reading, Jesus is talking about evil and the devil in the reading in Mark. It's not something we talk about all that often, even in the church anymore. It's become kind of a hokey thing to talk about because it's just one of those things. Kind of, I don't know, we don't always know how to approach that subject. You know what, though? One of the first things that the devil tries to take away from us when our lives are in upheaval is our hope. The first direction he pushes us into when our lives feel like they're chaotic is to despair. Despair in our futures, despair in our relationships. Despair takes many forms, not just sadness. Sometimes it manifests itself as pride. Sometimes as selfishness and anger. Sometimes exasperation. Ultimately it becomes indifference, a lack of engagement at all. And this is what the devil wants. If we resent each other enough, if we resent the situations we find ourselves in enough, if we close ourselves off to all our potential relationships, inevitably we will end up with no relationship with God either. And it's exactly that relationship of faith and of hope and of love that can lead us back in the other direction. Most of us have been brought up not just to pray, not just to attend Mass, but as mature people to discern God's will in our lives and to bring everything we have and are to God. This includes our anxieties, our resentments, our pain, our crosses. With God at the foot of His cross, that is truly the only place that we can leave those things. And if we don't, we end up carrying them by ourselves. And then once in a while, maybe we even decide to consciously or unconsciously dump them on someone else. If our prayer isn't honest, then our communication can't be either. So be honest with God so that we can be honest with each other. This is something that has taken me a long time to learn in my own life. Why did Jesus come into this world? Eternity, resurrection, the renewal of creation, those things are all true. But how does that occur? Fundamentally through reconciliation. But for there to be reconciliation, there is an assumption that hurt already exists. It assumes loss. It assumes injustice. It assumes separation from each other, from God. The greatest gift that the world has ever been given was not given because everything was great, but because there was a great need, and there still is a great need. I was reading through a lot of different things as I prepared for tonight. And although I chose not to directly engage all of them, one that seemed appropriate and down to earth came from actually Pope Francis himself at the Festival of Families in Philadelphia just a few short months ago. He addressed the imperfection that exists in the world, of the difficult situations that exist in families. He acknowledged brokenness. And then he said beautiful words which were directed not at perfect families, but at all families. He said, "The family has a divine identity card. Do you see what I mean? God gave the family an identity card so that families could be places in our world where his truth and love and beauty could continue to take root and grow." Now, some of you may say to me, "Father, you can say that because you're not married." Certainly in the family there are difficulties. In families we argue. In families sometimes we throw dishes. In families children cause headaches. I'm not going to say anything about mothers-in-law. Families always, always have crosses, always. Because the love of God, the Son of God, also asks us to follow him along this way. But in families also the cross is followed by resurrection, because there too the Son of God leads us. So the family is, if you excuse the word, a workshop of hope, of the hope of life and resurrection, since God was the one who opened this path. Then too there are children. Children are hard work. When we were children, we were hard work. Sometimes back at home, I see some of my staff who come to work with rings under their eyes. They have a 1 or 2 month old baby, and I ask them, "Didn't you get any sleep?" And they say, "No, the baby cried all night." In families, there are difficulties, but those difficulties are resolved by love. Hatred doesn't resolve any difficulty. Divided hearts do not resolve difficulties. Only love is capable of resolving difficulty. Love is a celebration. Love is joy. Love is perseverance. My own family was not one that prayed incessantly, but faith in God was always present. My family was not one that always communicated well, that always dealt with every issue openly, that existed and exists without resentment or without hurt. But love was and always is present. And whether or not we always recognize that the love began and ended with God, it was something I think we have come to recognize later. And I can honestly say that the times when our faith became kind of marginalized and when our hope was ignored, that's when we went the most wrong together. We need to pray together, to be people of faith together, because grace and reconciliation and mercy are things that come from God. We cannot experience something that we are not open to. We cannot share it with each other if we don't experience it ourselves first. That would seem kind of like a natural place to end, but I think there's one more thing that's required, at least one more acknowledgement that I need to make. It goes back to something I talked about at the beginning. While some family upheaval happens and is beyond our control, some situations are unplanned and not things we have chosen for ourselves. However, many of the situations that can produce a blended family, more often than not, are situations that also cause us difficulty in the church, especially when things like separation and divorce are part of the equation. This is a point of much difficulty in the lives of many who I come across. I'm sure Father Jay, too. It's a point that's obviously difficulty in my own family. Both of my parents, if I have to be honest, are living in unions that are, at the very least, in the eyes of the church that I serve in, irregular. It is true that while church teaching is meant to be the affirmation and the strengthening of something that is an ultimate good, I also am profoundly aware of the hurt that the lack of a full recognition by that same church can cause. How it causes many to feel excluded, to feel judged, to feel marginalized, even if that isn't the intent. It's something that I'm not going to be able to rectify tonight. It's a difficulty that remains with us. It is unfortunately a complication that we ourselves have added to family life in this world. However, it is also our responsibility as the church, as countless popes and bishops and other leaders have called us to do in the last decades, to walk something of a tightrope. It's a call to walk the very difficult line between the compassion and the love and the mercy of God, but to do so without compromising the truth. It's a balance that we struggle with, that we sometimes take 2 steps forward with and then 1 step back as members of the church. It is, however, as I said, a balance that we are called to, and we have been called to it for decades. So I'm going to end with the acknowledgement of this difficulty and in the realization that the delicate balance it requires is one we don't always reach even when we try, but we need to keep trying. I'm going to quote from a very significant letter. It was an apostolic exhortation of St. John Paul II, which followed the Church's Synod on the Family in the Modern World in 1981. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The Synod on the Family in the Modern World. We just had one of those again. This one is from 36 years ago. It's a sweeping and it's a beautiful letter. It's characteristically long because it's from John Paul II. The section I'm going to quote is specifically directed to pastors dealing with, in this particular case, divorced family members, but I think it applies to more than just them. It's a call without compromising teaching and truth to allow and encourage families, even in their imperfection, to be places of prayer and grace and of the Spirit of God. It says this, I earnestly call upon pastors in the whole community of the faithful to help them with solicitous care to make sure that they do not consider themselves as separated from the church. For as baptized persons, they can and indeed must share in her life. They should be encouraged to listen to the Word of God, to attend the sacrifice of the Mass, to persevere in prayer, to contribute to works of charity and to community efforts in favor of justice, to bring up their children in the Christian faith, to cultivate the spirit and practice of penance, and thus implore day by day God's grace. Let the church pray for them, encourage them, and show herself a merciful mother, and thus sustain them in faith and in hope. May the church always encourage families, no matter how they have come together, to do all of these things, so that all of us today and in the future through our own families may be sustained in that same faith and hope. And that's it.